So are you going to actually tell me the topic? Because the countdown is done.
Oh, right. Howard Johnson.
Howard Johnson, Hojo's. Right on, right on.
Yeah.
The aqua building with the orange roof. We stayed at some when I was a little kid.
Oh, is that right?
Howard Johnson's. All right. Well,
Yeah.
hey, let me do something real quick. Hey, welcome to the Empire Builders podcast. It's Dave Young here with Stephen Semple, and today we're going to talk about Howard Johnson's, as seen in Mad Men.
Yes.
And it was a monster. It sort of preceded the Holodome trend that Holiday Inn started. I think Holiday Inn kind of kicked their ass with the Holodome concept.
Oh, yeah.
That's my guess.
Here's the thing. In 1965, sales of Howard Johnson's exceeded that of McDonald's, Burger King, and KFC combined.
Wow, that's many exceeds.
Yes. So when we talk about how it used to be a powerhouse, it was a monster that just seems to have disappeared. Like you see the odd one here and there.
Yeah. So let me, if I had to guess, the trend of as I mentioned, Holiday Inn, Holodome sort of things. But my guess is that Howard Johnson's big rise was before the interstate highway system was built, or right along with it.
Right along
in
with
some
it.
places.
Yes.
But in the East, probably predates it.
Yeah, because there's a couple of really interesting things. Because as we mentioned, it's not a big powerhouse today. There may even be people that we're talking to that might not even know what the heck Howard Johnson is. So at its peak, it was massive. And basically, it was a motor hotel along with a restaurant. So they would have both. They had the restaurant, they had the motor hotel along with it.
Right.
Now, it started on the restaurant side. That's where it started. And in fact, it was the first ever restaurant franchise. They were the first ones to do franchising for a restaurant.
So kind of it was the prototype for Denny's and all of those. Yeah.
All of those,
Howard Johnson's
yeah.
was there.
Yeah. And the type of restaurant it was that fast casual dining. Yeah. It's kind of like, really, it was kind of like a diner, right? So it was the first ever franchise, and the first location, this wasn't the franchise location, but the first location was Orleans, Cape Cod, right at the intersection of Route 28 and Route 6A. And Howard Deering Johnson grew up outside of Boston in Quincy. And his first business was a drugstore that he inherited from his father in 1925, along with a whole pile of debt. And the business was a money loser. It had a soda fountain, a newsstand, and sold ice cream. Again, very much like those 1920s drugstores. You know, we think about a drugstore today, and it's not a place that you hung out. In the 1920s, it was a place that you hung out and said there was soda fountain, all that other stuff. And they sold 3 flavors of ice cream: chocolate, vanilla, strawberry. And one of the things that he did, so one of the first things he did was he expanded the newspaper business. He got kids out delivering newspapers, and that stabilized the business from a financial standpoint. But the next thing he wanted to do was improve the quality and offer more flavors of ice cream. He decided to lean into the ice cream. So he experimented with ingredients until he decided to double the butterfat content in the ice cream.
That's a smart move.
And it was a hit. All of a sudden, he's selling tons of ice cream. He then followed this with grilled hot dogs and fried clams in this drugstore. Became so popular that in 1925, he decided to open an ice cream stand in Wollaston Beach. Now, I find this hard to believe, but legend has it that it was so popular that he would sell as many as 14,000 ice cream cones in a day.
Whoa, that's a lot of ice cream cones.
That's a lot. It really is, isn't it?
That's a big line. Makes me want to stop and do the math. Like how many an hour is that? It's a lot.
It's like what, 20 a minute or something like that, 15 a minute. Anyway, that's legend. I'm not saying it's fact. Legend.
Okay.
But the point is, even if it's not a number like that, the point is it was damn popular, right? To even create that type of legend. So in 1929, he decides to open the first restaurant in Quincy, Square, 1929, opens a restaurant. Early 1929. Okay. Well, what happens in 1929? Like stock market crash puts a real crimp in things. And he survives, but barely. Along comes 1935, and he wants to expand. And he finds this empty lot in a perfect location. And here's what he believes. Like going back to your point, what he notices is the automobile is gaining in popularity and is going to change everything. And so what he wants is a location near a highway with lots of parking and high visibility. Because what he's noticed is that what people want is good food that's fast at a reasonable price. They want to be able to pull in, get their food, move on. So to your point, Dave, Howard Johnson grew initially with the growth of the automobile, and that was on purpose because that's what Howard observed. He had just kind of survived, Great Depression. He didn't have money to lease the land and build, and banks were not really handing out cash at this point. Things were still very tight. And the land is owned by Eugene Sprague, and Howard approaches Eugene's son, Reginald. And he knew Reginald. They were buddies, and asked Reginald if he'd like to operate the second location. And it was going to be a carbon copy of the first. And the idea was this. Howard was going to let them use the name. He was going to provide the design, and they were going to buy the food, etc., from him. So really, the concept of franchising restaurant is born. Sure. Now, what we also know is Martha Hopper had already done that in hair salons, right? He was now going to be applying this idea to restaurants. And so they go ahead with it, and it's the first franchise restaurant. And by the end of 1935, so they opened this in 1935, they're serving 700 meals a day, not including ice cream. Like it is really, really doing well. And this success leads Howard to open more. By 1939, 4 years later, so in 4 years, they go from 2 locations. 4 years later, 107 locations, grossing over $10 million.
Wow.
In sales. Yeah.
107. He's either a logistical systems sort of genius, or he had somebody at headquarters that was just driving this ship. Yeah.
Yep. So along comes World War II hits. There's food rationing, gas rationing, but they managed to stay in business by supplying the military. Because now, after the war, to help with expansion, labor is always a challenge. But here's what he did after the war. He created, when you talk about logistics, he suddenly realized that they needed to get a hold of the logistics, and he learned a lot supplying the army with food. Here's what you decide to do is the idea of a central location, preparing the food with the restaurant just finishing it.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Right?
So like hash browns and...
Basically like how it's done today.
At McDonald's, yeah.
Where the stuff is partially cooked, sent out, and the restaurant finishes it. Basically like how caterers do it. What you learn when you're supplying the army. Yeah. Right?
All right.
So now this made it easier. It made everything standardized. And they always had this idea, because every location looked the same, was the really visible roof. Because remember, his whole idea was visible locations. And beginning in 1954, so up until 1954, everything was just the restaurants. 1954, they started adding motor lodges to the mix.
Okay.
Right? And at the peak, they peaked out at over 1,000 locations.
Holy mackerel.
Right? Huge.
That's a lot. Yeah, yeah.
And as we mentioned earlier, in 1965, their sales exceeded that of McDonald's, Burger King, and KFC combined.
Stay tuned. We're going to wrap up this story and tell you how to apply this lesson to your business right after this.
Hey, Rick, how's it going?
Great.
Great?
Yeah, I just had an amazing 90 minutes.
You did?
With the host of the Empire Builders podcast.
Really?
You've heard the podcast.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I finally took them up on the starter session.
So you drank the Kool-Aid?
Guzzled it.
How did it taste?
Well, he answered those questions that were keeping me up at night. Now I know what I need to do. So it tasted like strawberries.
Really?
Yep.
Oh, and you can book your free starter session on this podcast website.
Okay, Dave. Say, and they haven't missed a thing.
Let's pick up our story where we left off, and trust me, you haven't missed a thing.
1978, Howard Johnson sold the company for $630 million.
Oh, okay. He sold it in 78. Was it still as big as it was in 65?
Its growth had slowed and it had started to decline. But, it was still, I don't know how many locations it had when it sold, but it was still huge.
Fascinating. So was it a leveraged buyout kind of a thing? I asked that because there's so many businesses that meet their demise shortly after they sell to someone. Often it's a hedge fund, or back in the day it was called a leveraged buyout, where these people that were just investors buy something thinking that it's not going to require their input.
Right. Well, it was sold to a company out of London, England called Imperial Group. And Imperial Group, owned things like Continental Baking, and they had some involvement with Marriott. And today, Howard Johnson is owned by Wyndham. Wyndham owns Howard Johnson today.
How many locations today? What's left?
280 locations today.
You certainly don't see them as often, and it's always kind of a special treat when you come across one. For somebody our age that goes, oh yeah, I remember them when I was a kid.
Right. Now, they don't have any of the restaurants anymore. The restaurants went defunct. The only thing that exists is just the motor hotels. Yeah.
You know what was always, I think probably one of the brilliant moves that he made was just the color choice.
Yes.
The orange roof and the blue building.
Yes.
And I've worked with so many retailers over the year, and you can't get them to step outside their front door and look at their business from more than 20 feet away.
Yes.
The very first retailers, I was like, okay, I actually wrote a post. I should find it. This is 20 years ago. Just a way to check the experience factor of your business. So look at your business, step outside your door, look at it from 10 feet away, and then double that and look at it from 20 feet away. And then just double that a couple more times till you're a couple blocks away. And do you stand out in any way at all? And you could see a Howard Johnson's from miles.
Yes. But it's really interesting that you should say that. So we've interviewed in the past Rick Showers from Noble RV. When Rick opened his latest location, he opened it a couple years ago, and it's basically one of those ones where you've got a road that parallels the highway, and he's on that road. So he's not right on the highway, but he's seen
kind
from
of a frontage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when I was out seeing him and he was doing his signage, what did we do? We stepped across the street. We took a look at it. We walked down the road. We took a look at it. We drove by, because in his location, it wasn't just what was going on with him. It's always about this context, what was around it. Yeah. And here's where Jay Mystery, one of our partners who's a designer, is brilliant. Jay said, isn't it interesting? People are going to be driving home at around the time the sun sets. So he specifically set the sign at the angle and put the sign with certain tonality in it. So when the sun sets, it just vibrates. Like you cannot ignore it.
It's not reflecting sunlight in people's eyes. It's just being hit by that golden hour sun in colors that burst forth. Yes,
and the colors that burst forth. And then what we did is at night, we have a spotlight on it, and we made sure the spotlight had the right elements that when it hit that sign, that the sign just glows. Now, in his case, it worked out really well because he had a self-storage lot on one side and a self-storage lot on the other side that weren't very lit. So it was also very dark around him.
Oh, yeah,
But that's the context that we used to make sure his place was super visible. It goes to your point. Step outside your store and take a look at it. And what are you going to do to become that visible location? This is what Howard Johnson did. Howard Johnson said, I see the automobile becoming a thing. I see people traveling around. If they're traveling around, they're looking at the road. I got to make my place not only convenient and have parking, but visible.
Absolutely. And this is advertising 101, right? Yet so many business owners don't get it. This is a lesson McDonald's learned decades ago. All the gas companies learned decades ago. If you're driving down, have you ever driven across Kansas? You've driven across Canada. Shoot,
yes.
You drive across Manitoba. It's as flat as Kansas.
Yeah. Yes.
Right? It is.
Yeah.
But you drive across Kansas or Nebraska, and the kids are finally, after a couple hours, the kids are waking up and they're a little cranky because they got to pee. And you start scanning the horizon, and pretty soon this faint, tiny little set of McDonald's arches is visible on the horizon, and there's probably a familiar looking gas sign popping up in, way in the air next to it. And those are usually your first sightings. In some cases, there are some McDonald's in some of the flat states that you can see 5 miles out.
Well, and you know what's interesting with all this, Dave, is talking about small towns. I live in a small town. Town I live in is 20,000 people. And there's businesses here that are actually, on Main Street or whatever. And their automatic assumption is, because lots of people live here and have lived here for a long time, and it's a small town, everyone knows where I am. I had a business the other day that I Googled, and it turns out they're right on the main highway. And I've lived here full time for 6 years. I've been coming up here for decades. They've been around forever. I had no idea they existed. Yeah. Why? They have no signage. They just assume, oh, well, we're here. Everyone knows we're here. Everyone knows we're here. Well, it's like, no, not everyone does. Don't make that assumption.
and now often it's not the business owner's fault. Often it's very restrictive codes that cities put in place.
It can be.
When I lived in Tucson, one of the cities just north of Tucson, Oro Valley, they're part of the Tucson Metro. But I don't know how long ago, maybe 20 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, they passed these really restrictive sign ordinances that required businesses to have a sign in the city's color. So it was like a verdigris, sort of the green that copper turns into.
Yep.
And so the Target store had a green Target on it.
Wow.
McDonald's couldn't have golden arches. They had to have green. I mean, it was insane. It's just surreal driving around where those signs still exist. Now, they've changed the law since, but a lot of companies just never redid the signs.
But if that's the context, that's the challenge everyone else is facing. You got to kind of come up with ideas.
Yeah.
Like you can't roll over and sort of go, I can't do anything. You got to figure out what you're going to do.
That's the brilliant thing about some logos that use shape as an iconic. You're still going to recognize Target. You're still going to recognize McDonald's. Yeah. And the thing that I'll end on this. I know we're running over time, but the thing that most businesses forget is that signage, paint, big orange rooftops, and bright blue buildings, all of those things are permanent advertising.
They are.
Right? And you don't have to pay somebody for the color orange on your roof, Howard Johnson, every year.
And if you want to learn more about this, because this whole concept of shape and color is language. And if you want to learn more about this, go to wizardacademy.org and watch for Dave's course on the 12 languages of the portals and the 12 languages of the mind.
Yeah.
I took this course. It's freaking amazing. That's where you can learn more about this.
Thank you. I've got to find the dates and get it posted for.
You better get it posted now because people are going to be looking.
I know. Well, thanks for the trip down memory lane and stopping at a Hojo's for some hash browns and such.
And ice cream with twice the buttermilk.
Yeah, 14,000 cones. Yikes. Thank you, Stephen.
All right. Thanks, David.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. Please share us. Subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave us a big, fat, juicy 5-star rating and review. And if you have any questions about this or any other podcast episode, email to questions@theempirebuilderspodcast.com.